The Girl Who Built a Spider by George Brewington. Chapters 40 through 42. Chapter 40, The Dream Scout. Beyond the door was a huge chamber, softly lit with glowing blue computer screens and white candles. An even bigger fountain gurgled in the corner, filled with water that poured from the taps connected to the pipes of water that flowed through all the walls of the laboratory. In the middle of the chamber was another pluff mud trunk, tilted at an angle above a pool of mud warmed to 100 degrees. From this trunk, however, a series of cables left the box and connected to a computer on a table at its side. The ornithopter motor suddenly shut off, and Lando Calrissian glided down for a perfect landing on the table, stopping next to the computer with its camera facing the fountain. On the screen, an image of the fountain suddenly appeared. "The doctor is sleeping," Miss Curie said softly. "Zachary would not let me wake him. It was the best way to protect him from harm, he said. I suppose he was right. None of his inventions could malfunction and hurt him here." Teresa's father walked closer and peeked in the window of the pluff mud trunk. "He's in there all right, and there's wires connected to his head." "Please wake him," Thomas said, more excited than a kid on his birthday. "I have something to show him." Miss Curie rolled up to the trunk and slid her fingertip along the control panel. The lid of the pluff mud trunk popped open, and the mud began to pour out of it, returning to the pool below. Dr. Flax was inside, wearing a wetsuit made of pineapple fiber. He was quite muddy and still asleep. Miss Curie pressed another button on the control panel. Jets on either side of the doctor turned on and sprayed him with warm water. In moments, he was clean of mud, and his eyes flickered open. "Well, well, well, well. That was undoubtedly the longest nap I've ever taken. But sure, we have accomplished a lot during my extended respite, didn't we?" "What do you mean?" John asked. "You've been asleep the whole time. We saved your laboratory from your evil nephews. By the way, Teresa and I deserve a reward." Dr. Flax laughed. "A reward you deserve indeed, Mr. Cooper. You worked very well together when Zachary and his doppelganger tried to wrestle this laboratory away from me. I fear they would have kept me in eternal dream status if they had their way. But you were quick on your feet with my plastic-eating goo, and Miss Brown proved that she could give quite an inspirational speech when the battle seemed nearly lost. You would make a fine general, Miss Brown, if you ever chose to leave the sciences." Then the doctor turned to Ashley. "And great thanks to you, Miss Dean. How difficult it must have been to give up this entire laboratory to do the right thing. That took great courage." John was about to protest, but Teresa stomped her shoeless foot on his to shut him up. "But how did you know?" Ashley asked, completely embarrassed by the part she had played in the events of the morning. Dr. Flax put his finger up excitedly. "By the camera on my ornithopter, of course. This flying machine was my first invention ever. When I was 10 years old, I replicated the design of my hero, Leonardo da Vinci. I made it out of plastic and tarp I found around the house, although I've made many upgrades over the years. I placed a tiny computer and camera on its beak and discovered how to control it with my thoughts alone." He excitedly took the 3 cables from the computer and attached them to Teresa's head with 3 small stickers. Then he clicked a few keys on the computer's keyboard. "I call it my Dream Scout. By connecting these leads to Miss Brown's thalamus, medial prefrontal cortex, and posterior cingulate cortex, she can close her eyes and see what the Dream Scout sees. Try it." Teresa closed her eyes, and indeed, as if she hadn't closed her eyes at all, she could see the fountain gurgling in the corner. When she opened her eyes, she was looking at the doctor again. "Over time and with lots of practice, I learned I could fly the Dream Scout with my thoughts even as I slept.
This has been very useful to my work, as I've always found that 8 hours of sleep a day, although important for the body, is an awfully long recess for the mind. Besides, I couldn't waste any time knowing that Tommy was missing. Every night I put myself in this tank and searched for him with the Dream Scout. That is, until my nephew locked me in here like Snow White, to slumber while my prince and 2 princesses arrived to save me. And see here, you've arrived as expected. You've earned extra credit too by rescuing my dear Tommy.
Dr. Flax knelt down and stretched his arms wide. Thomas came running to hug him tight.
I've missed you, Father,
Thomas said. Dr. Flax kissed him on the forehead.
I've missed you too, my sweet boy. Why is Lando Calrissian the pilot?
John asked. Dr. Flax picked up the action figure and straightened him out in his hand.
Because I'm a big Star Wars fan, and besides, don't you think we look alike?
The doctor placed little Lando's face next to his own. Maybe, Teresa thought. But if the doctor had ever resembled the handsome, smooth-talking scoundrel, it was probably years ago.
So, you saw everything that happened?
Ashley said with worry.
You saw me make a deal with Zachary to take over the lab? You saw me throw my alginasium at Teresa and John, and then you saw me force them to sign the contract?
I did, Miss Dean,
Dr. Flax said quietly.
I'm so sorry,
she blurted out.
I'm so ashamed. I was so greedy. If I had known you were watching.
Then you would have never acted as you did, Dr. Flax said. Think of yourself as a subject in one of my most interesting experiments. You've proven yourself to be an ambitious young woman, Miss Dean. A quality I suspect will bring you far in your scientific career and will also get you into a great deal of trouble.
Ashley had to look away in embarrassment, and again John was about to say something until Teresa bopped him on the shoulder to be quiet.
Father,
Thomas said, eagerly pulling on the doctor's wetsuit,
I have something incredible to show you. Yes, Thomas, yes. We certainly have a lot to review and discuss, don't we? You'll be so proud of me,
Thomas said, pulling off his winter coat and scarf. His metal chest, they all saw, contained a cabinet just like his sister's, although he was covered with a layer of frost.
I've been keeping it ice cold for days, he said,
and he opened his cabinet to show everyone what was contained inside. Chapter 41, Consequentiality. Sitting inside Thomas's chest was a block of ice. Frozen inside the block of ice was a tiny hand folded into a fist. Dr. Flax reached into Thomas's chest and removed the ice and stared at it in wonder.
What is this?
He asked.
I must confess my programming put me into a bit of a quandary,
Thomas explained.
When I learned of Zachary's plan to take over the laboratory and use it to replicate himself, I knew he had become your biggest threat and that it was my duty to destroy him. But he threw me out of Flax Industries and told me never to return, or else he would destroy and dismantle my sister, which was equally unacceptable.
Marie Curie shyly bowed her head.
But even in exile, Father, I continued to assist you,
Thomas said.
I struggled with why flaxium would not react with water the way you desired. I calculated and pondered and experimented with a small supply of flaxium I had stored in my chest, and I still cannot figure out why it would not create ice. I was so frustrated, a peculiar feeling I had never felt before, until one night, sitting in the pineapple field in the pouring rain, I was so absolutely frustrated with myself that I couldn't figure out the problem. I squeezed one little ball of flaxium in my fist until...
Dr. Flax gasped as he realized what had happened.
Until the flaxium crystallized into ice under the intense pressure of your robotic grip?
Yes,
Thomas said, beaming with pride.
My wet hand froze solid. Luckily, I always keep a spare hand on me.
Dr. Flax hugged Thomas and pressed his forehead to the little robot's own with delight.
Of course, I should have thought of it myself. Elements can do mysterious things under pressure. Sodium becomes transparent like glass. Carbon solidifies into diamond, and flaxium transforms into a catalyst that causes the water around it to freeze into solid ice,
Thomas said, his electric blue eyes shining bright. Dr. Flax shook his head in amazement.
You did it, Thomas. You really did it.
Oh, Father, I'm sure you would have discovered the properties of your element under extreme conditions yourself if you hadn't spent so much of your time running around looking for me.
No, Thomas, that's not what I meant. You felt frustration. That's the real accomplishment here. You felt genuine frustration that you couldn't solve the problem before you. Now you know what it's like to be a real, live human inventor. I dare say, my boy, you're evolving quite nicely.
Thomas Edison grinned from robot ear to robot ear. Can we try it out? Teresa asked.
Yes, of course. I'm eager to see for myself. Let's go to the Big Zero and give it a try.
Dr. Flax and Thomas ran out the door, and Teresa, Ashley, John, Marie Curie, and George Brown hurried to keep up with them. When they arrived, Dr. Flax turned on the spotlights, and the deep pool of water shimmered before them. Dr. Flax and Thomas looked at each other like excited children. Dr. Flax picked up one of the small transparent boxes containing a dark marble of flaxium suspended in oil.
Would you like to do the honor, Thomas?
It would be my pleasure to finally fulfill my programming,
he said, closing his eyes tight. Thomas Edison took the box from his father and knelt by the side of the pool. "Well, what's happening?" Teresa's father asked her. "The end of hurricanes," Teresa said with delight. Thomas removed the marble from its box, placed it in his palm, and then thrust his hand into the pool of water. And he squeezed. He squeezed and squeezed until they all heard a distinct crack. They all held their breath as the flaxium reacted with the water, creating a chain reaction that transformed the entire pool into an enormous block of ice, with Thomas's hand frozen just below the surface.
Yes,
the doctor cried. He did it, Teresa whispered, and she felt as if the world had changed right there in front of her. John, who was still wearing only socks, ran and slid across the surface of the ice.
Check it out! It's really ice all the way down!
John skated around and around.
I appear to have frozen my hand again,
Thomas said. The little robot unscrewed his icy fist from his wrist as Dr. Flax leaned down to feel the surface.
I'm so proud of you, Tommy,
he said quietly.
Thank you.
Teresa stepped closer to Dr. Flax and sat next to him beside the frozen pool. She had to ask,
This is it, right, Dr. Flax? Your magnum opus is a success? This is how we stop hurricanes?
She felt like her heart popped out of her chest at the excitement of the possibility. There was about to be a big change. The world is a better place now, she thought, until Dr. Flax put his arm around her.
I know that's what you want more than anything,
Dr. Flax said softly.
You want to make certain no other children lose their mothers to flood waters. I pray no other children ever lose as much as you have.
George Brown closed his eyes and smiled in a way Teresa knew very well. He was thinking about his Bonnie, her mom. Sad and wonderful memories that, for him, probably seemed like only yesterday. Dr. Flax stood up and helped Teresa to her feet.
I propose we have our afternoon discussion now, shall we? Mr. Brown, feel free to join us.
Were they really going to have their daily discussion right then and there? Teresa, Ashley, and John couldn't believe it, but Dr. Flax put his hands behind his back and waited until they all formed a semicircle around him, including One-Handed Thomas, Marie Curie, and even George Brown.
I'd like to discuss consequentiality today. It's a sing-songy 7-syllable word I like very much. Can anyone guess what it might mean?
Ashley, as usual, raised her hand fast and high.
Yes, Miss Dean.
I think it means to have big consequences, like when you do something and the results are really important.
Quite correct, Miss Dean,
The doctor said.
Consequentiality, important and significant results of an action. Now, Miss Brown is quite right. Thanks to Thomas's experiments, Flaxium presents us with a very tempting opportunity. By applying intense pressure, we could, if we wanted to, create an iceberg in the Atlantic Ocean right off the coast of Charleston. The water surface would cool, and because hurricanes are fueled by the heat energy of warm currents, an incoming hurricane might be chilled so much that it would be reduced to a harmless breeze. Hundreds of lives could potentially be saved. It sounds pretty good, right?
Teresa nodded vigorously. Dr. Flax clapped his hands lightly together in thought.
But let us consider what else might occur.
Teresa felt her heart sink in her chest. She knew the answer, but she didn't dare raise her hand. She didn't want to answer or hear the answer. She knew where this train of thought ended. Her dream would end with it. Her father was looking at her sadly. He knew it too. He raised his hand.
Yes, Mr. Brown.
Well, I'm only speculating, Teresa's father said. But if an iceberg suddenly appeared off our coast, all the surrounding sea life would be shocked or even killed. Fish, shrimp, all the marine life of the low country would die. Our entire ecosystem would be disrupted, maybe even wiped out. Charleston and many other towns along the coast would be ruined.
Dr. Flax nodded sadly.
We scientists imagine the possibility of an invention. Can we create it? We measure its practicality. Who would benefit? But then, and this might be the hardest part of the inventor's job, we must consider consequentiality. We must be honest with ourselves about what our invention might do to the world, even if we love it.
But,
Teresa stammered.
what if, isn't there a way?
Not here,
Dr. Flax said sadly.
Not in the Atlantic Ocean. Your father is correct. Creating an iceberg off the coast of Charleston might slow hurricanes, but the consequences to the surrounding marine life would be far too devastating.
Teresa desperately didn't want this to be true.
You see, little girl, your dreams, like my uncle's, will remain fantasy because my uncle is the world's most brilliant coward.
They all jumped with a start and turned around to see who had walked into the big zero behind them. How could it be? But it certainly appeared to be true. Zachary Flax had copied himself a third time. Chapter 42, The Answer.
Greetings, Zachary,
Dr. Flax said with a sigh.
Thank you for coming, my boy. I owe you an apology. I didn't give you the programming you required, and I've never acknowledged you as my son. And for those 2 mistakes, I am truly sorry.
The third Zachary's eyes glowed with golden rage as he stepped forward.
I'm not and never have been your boy,
he said with icy cold menace. George Brown moved between him and the children.
Don't come a step closer,
he said, and he meant it. Zachary started laughing even more wickedly than his first 2 brothers.
Not to worry, Mr. Brown. I have no interest in you or the children. I'm not even interested in this laboratory. Unlike my two misguided older brothers, I seek something far more rewarding than replication or revolution. I seek revenge.
Dr. Flax reached out his arms as if he wanted to give Zachary a hug and tell him everything was going to be all right. But the third Zachary suddenly made a fist and punched a hole into the wall beside him. The water that had been flowing through the wall came flooding out. He ran across the room and punched a hole in the opposite wall, too. Even more water gushed forth, cracking more of the wall open as it came in torrents. Then he picked up one of the marbles of flaxium from the table.
"Zachary, please,"
was all Dr. Flax could say before Zachary put his hand into one of the spouts of gushing water and squeezed. The water turned to ice. Zachary, still staring at the doctor with absolute fury, was frozen solid. The flaxium began its chemical reaction, freezing every molecule of water it touched. The walls began to crack. They all stepped out into the main hall of the laboratory and watched as springs of water burst violently from the walls and quickly turned into branches of ice. The laboratory began to crumble around them as trees of ice sprang in all directions, sprouting all the way to the grand fountain by the laboratory's entrance and even further. The laboratory, once a lush subtropical garden, rapidly froze. Every petal of every flower covered in icy crystals. Teresa could only stare until her father grabbed her and held her to him to protect her and cover her from any ice shards that might fly in their direction. But in moments, the chain reaction was over, and the paper mill mall that had become a laboratory of dreams had now become an enormous, silent, frozen sculpture on a hot summer day. Dr. Flax stepped up to the second-story guardrail and, without a scream or even a sigh, looked over it all.
"It's quite beautiful, isn't it?"
the doctor said. He smiled and folded his hands behind his back.
"If you ever need evidence that magic exists in this world, you need only look upon the wonder of ice."
Teresa's father was astounded by his calmness.
"But, Dr. Flax, your laboratory, it's all destroyed. This place was your dream."
"Indeed, Mr. Brown, was being the operative word in that sentence."
Dr. Flax stepped up to the frozen Zachary and knocked lightly on his forehead. Zachary's frosted and lightless eyes stared back at him, anger permanently etched on his frozen plastic face.
What an excellent demonstration to end today's discussion. As my dear Zachary has shown us, the consequences of releasing one's inventions into the world can be great. In the wrong hands, flaxium has proven it is capable of destroying an entire laboratory, perhaps more. We must always be wary that taking our creations out of our laboratories and into the public can have unexpected, if not devastating, results. Oh, my dear Zachary, after I thaw you out and adjust your programming, we're going to have a long, long talk. I was so wrong to deny you the burden of being a son. You deserved a father to guide you, not abandon you and let you run completely wild."
Aren't you sad, though?
Ashley asked.
Everything you built is gone. You have to start all over.
Dr. Flax shrugged.
"Repairs will be needed, yes, but Miss Dean, there is nothing more fun than starting over. But not today. You all need to go home and rest. That much is certain. I have missed several meals, so I must go in search of lunch. I don't believe Zachary will ever again grace me with one of his salads. Pity. He was a genius with roasted pecans."
So that's it?
John asked incredulously.
No more labs? No more inventing? I won't be able to complete my masterpiece? My bubble organ?
Dr. Flax started laughing.
Listen to Mr. Cooper, everybody. His enthusiasm for bubbles has not been squelched in the least. Thank goodness, because your summer has only just begun.
What? Teresa asked.
Inventors don't need such luxurious quarters as this. The size of one's laboratory does not matter. I happen to own a decommissioned yacht that I purchased from the U.S. Navy. It has ample space for scientific experimentation.
John lit up.
Are you saying what I think you're saying?
Dr. Flax smiled mischievously as they all began to catch on. Where would we go? Teresa asked.
Away from Charleston? The Florida Keys?
Ashley asked hopefully.
The Amazon?
John said, jumping off his feet.
I was thinking of heading north,
Dr. Flax said, clapping his hands lightly together.
Icebergs may not belong in the Atlantic, but they certainly belong in the Arctic Sea. We could conduct our flaxium experiments more safely up there. I also thought it might be interesting to try to bring cold water up from the bottom of the ocean to cool the surface with bubbles created from compressed air pushed through a long submerged pipe. I imagine we'll require accompanying music.
Hey, we could model it after my bubble organ,
John shouted.
There's an idea,
Dr. Flax said, as if he hadn't already thought of it.
And if we're going to feed the barren regions of the world flavored algae, we should see how our crops fare under extreme conditions.
Ashley smiled and looked at her feet, not saying a word, but Teresa could tell she was happy to be back in the doctor's good graces.
Do you think your bubble organ could play Disney songs?
Teresa asked.
I don't know about that,
John said, rolling his eyes.
Fantasia?
Ashley said quickly, lifting her head up. Teresa smiled, and just like that, she knew she had her friend back. Dr. Flax clapped his hands lightly together in thought.
Of course we'll need a form of transportation to get around when our little yacht can sail no farther north. There certainly won't be any roads to take us from glacier to glacier,
Dr. Flax said.
What better way to get around than by mechanical spider, especially if it's equipped with skis compatible with water, snow, or ice.
Teresa grinned from ear to ear. Dr. Flax clapped his hands once together loudly, startling them all.
But I must get my yacht in working order. Thomas, I'll need to program you with all the basics of marine engineering. Marie, you will be tasked with safety procedures and making sure we are all adequately prepared for emergency situations that may arise in the ice-cold waters of the North Atlantic and Arctic. And I will need swimming lessons, that much is certain. Yes, indeed. This should all take about a year if we don't dilly-dally.
Then he turned to Zachary and placed a hand on his frozen plastic cheek. Zachary's eyes had dimmed from angry gold to lifeless gray, but his vengeful scowl remained.
My youngest son,
Dr. Flax said.
I will program you to collaborate with others. You can achieve so much more with family and friends than on your own.
Then Dr. Flax let out a long sigh full of regret, but also love. Yes, it was true, although Teresa could hardly believe it. Even though Zachary had tried to keep him locked up in a pluff mud trunk, the doctor still loved him, as only a father could.
Indeed, so much to do,
the doctor said, wiping a tear from his eye.
But first, lunch. An inventor must mind after one's own biological machinery. Thomas, do you think you could improvise?
I've never made lunch before, Father.
No matter,
the doctor said.
I think there's an extra loaf of pineapple bread in the kitchen and some freshly sliced pineapple in the leather room. Pineapple sandwich, anyone?
Wait a minute,
John said.
A year? What about my bubble organ? And all my algae experiments?
Ashley asked. The doctor shrugged.
You can continue your work until it's time to depart for the Arctic.
Wait a minute,
Teresa's father began to protest.
But I need my cool personal lab,
John said.
and I have so many algae to take care of here.
Ashley protested. Dr. Flax chuckled softly.
Do you know how many inventions I created in my parents' garage before I was even 16 years old?
Nobody answered, expecting this to be a rhetorical question.
42,
he answered proudly.
I can assure you a fancy laboratory is not necessary for the inventive mind.
But my lab,
Ashley said sadly.
yeah,
John said.
I have nowhere to work at home. I don't even have my own bedroom.
But that was when Teresa felt the hole inside her fill with light and shrink to almost practically nothing.
I have the answer,
she said quietly.
Our house.
Ashley and John looked at Teresa with hope, and Teresa looked at her father.
Can we, Dad? Can we divide the ground floor of the house into a 3-room laboratory?
Her father smiled. I think that's a fine idea. It's certainly more agreeable than sending you off to the Arctic on a decommissioned Navy yacht.
My house tomorrow, then,
Teresa said proudly and with renewed excitement.
9 to 5, wear something you're not afraid to get dirty. I'll provide a healthy and tasty lunch.
Dr. Flax smiled.
I knew the 3 of you would figure it out. Thomas, Marie, let us leave these inventors to their own devices. Take what you like from the lab, colleagues, even though it is frozen. I'm sure you can salvage quite a bit.
And then the doctor took Thomas's hand in his left hand and Marie's in his right, and the little family left to find something to eat.
But we are going to the Arctic next summer, right?
Ashley whispered into Teresa's ear. Teresa didn't say anything. Not yet. Not with her father standing right there. She would need at least a year to convince him. But she knew she would eventually win him over. He would eventually see how important such an adventure would be. She was already envisioning the magnificent journey north. She could see herself riding Bonnie across fresh sheets of ice created from flaxium. Yes, she would convince him. Her father would simply have to see that a trip to the Arctic in a floating laboratory was nothing short of an incredible, amazing, once-in-a-lifetime offer that she absolutely could not refuse.